So, good afternoon for those who came. Welcome to my session. The problem with adding brand names to your session titles is they tend to change from time to time, especially if you use Microsoft products. So you're not in secure multi-tenant apps with Azure and Visual Studio Online, nor are you in the session secure multi-tenant apps with Azure and Visual Studio Team Services, but we're here for multi-tenant apps with Azure and Azure DevOps, which is all the same brand names over the past few years and months of the same product. But actually the real title could have been just a story of one of my projects, because it's heavily based on work I did last year for a customer of mine. So first a bit about myself. I'm Michielsen. I'm a software consultant from Belgium, and I work for a company called InfoSupport. I work most of the time with .NET, but I try to keep look outside of my comfort zone and look at other environments and other programming languages as well, to stay on the lookout for anything good out there. But you have to pick something, so I work most of the time with .NET. I started in 2005, and it's already quite a different world now. So nowadays it's most of the time .NET web applications with a Angular front end or whatever people want me to write. This is a slide you will see a lot, because I don't have many slides. We'll be most of the time be busy in the Azure Portal, in Visual Studio Code, or in in Azure DevOps. I'll probably say the wrong name a lot. So if you don't want to see code or configuration, this is not the talk for you. You guys are staying, so that's good. So last year, the Belgian Football Association was looking for a way to enhance their process for applying for a license. Every year after when the season ends and a new season is going to start, every football club in the first league, which is called the Pro League in Belgium, has to apply for a license in order to gain access to the Pro League and participate in it. Not that any of these participate, because they don't football in Belgium, but they are Belgians, so you probably know some of them. So how did that process go up until last year? Well, lots of paperwork. It was based on Word templates, Excel spreadsheets, and emails they sent out to every football club, which they had to fill in and send them back to the Pro League. There were a handful of people who managed that process, and they ask information like, what's your stadium like? How is your organization structured? What companies are behind it? Who owns it? They need to say how much they invest in their youth organizations, how much they pay their players. So it's really intimate details about the football club that they have to send over to the licensing department of the Pro League. So that's a lot of paperwork that they ask, because they also need to supply the salary receipts of the players, etc. The football clubs all have to gather that information and send them back to the Pro League. One license application typically is at least 1,000 pages of A4 letter sizes that they have to read and go through them, and then send them back to the club. So yeah, you forgot this, that's not correct, you need to supply another document, etc., etc. So it's quite cumbersome, and there are 16 clubs in the first league, so it's again a hard process to manage. There are a handful of people, they had no IT infrastructure. So if somebody fell sick, they had to dive in his inbox and, yeah, what's the state of this project and how can we go further? So since it's called the Pro League, they wanted to professionalize everywhere, and they wanted a software project to manage this process. So they chose Azure, and that's where I got involved. This presentation is built up in 3 demos. We're first going to look at, let's use the default tooling that there's available in Azure in Azure DevOps and on the Azure Portal to create a secure application, and we'll then try to add some multi-tenancy to it, and then see how we can integrate it with the other tools that are available. So let's first look at building a single tenant application in Azure and Azure DevOps. It all starts with a resource group, which is a container for resources. And we should add an application service, which means I can host some code in there and it can be accessed externally. And let's say we're creating an application just for the licensing department, and somebody scans in all of those documents and adds them to the website. So you'll probably need to store some data. We'll add a storage account for it to store the physical scanned in documents, and perhaps a relational database, a SQL database, to store the process information. That's the easy part. And then we need to make a decision, because we need users. We could create a user table and start with that, or we could use another external software as a service product like Auth0 perhaps to manage that for us. But there's something you get for free in Azure, and that's called an Azure Active Directory. If you have an Azure subscription, you automatically have an Azure Active Directory. And so since we were in Azure, why not use this instead of building our own system? It can manage users, it can manage applications and link the two together seamlessly, or at least that's what the documentation told me. So let's see how that works. So I go to, here I'm signed in the Azure Portal. I'll zoom a bit. I have a resource group over here with the web application I mentioned earlier. Here you find the storage account for files, etc. And then here is my database attached to a database server. Here you see an entry for Azure Active Directory. So I just click there. And then there's an entry, app registrations. And there you can register applications that can be used by this Active Directory. If I click then View All, you'll see that I already added one single tenant application. Adding one is pretty straightforward. Just give it a name, say if it's a web app or a native application, and a URL. So I did that with this single tenant application already. And what you need to fill in, that's these reply URLs, because the application needs to, whenever you forward a sign-in request to Azure Active Directory, you tell Azure Active Directory, if you're signed in, then forward it to this application. So you need to add these as well. Since I'm using this same Active Directory for development and production, I have my development URLs here in as well. Of course, in real world, you would have a separate Active Directory for production. Is that it? Well, no. Then we need to look at the code. So here I have a project for my business logic and a web application for my front end. I added a NuGet package over here, which is this one. I don't have to use this one because Azure Active Directory can use OAuth, but it just has some configuration thingies which I don't have to configure myself, and it's just a shortcut method. So if I then go to startup, what did I do as well? Well, I added authentication to my application, and have to configure something, more about that in a bit. And I added a policy that only signed-in users can log into my application. It's just MVC. What do I need to configure as well? Well, I need to specify where the instance lives, which is just the Azure Active Directory for everyone. I could restrict this, but I didn't do that in this case. And you need a tenant ID, and that's already one of the things. What on earth is a tenant ID? And that's the ID of your own Active Directory, which is not called tenant ID in the Azure Portal. So if you go here to properties, and then you find this GUID, which is your tenant ID, but here it's called directory ID. So you just need to know these things. Then there's this client ID which you need, which is the ID of my application in Azure AD. So if I go back to the portal, and I go to my app registrations, you'll see here the application ID, which I also need to specify. And that's it. Now, any users from my Active Directory can sign into my application. So So if I click this, you'll see it forwards me to Azure Active Directory because I'm already signed in. I'm in the portal. It shows here my username, so I'm signed into this application. By default, every application you register in your Active Directory is available for every user of your Active Directory, which is probably not something you want. So you can restrict this. So if I go back to Azure AD, and now I don't go to app registration, but to enterprise applications, where I also find my single tenant application. If I then go to users and groups, you see my user account has been added here, but the tricky part is here. The properties, I can specify that user assignment is required. So only people who have been explicitly added to this application can actually access it. If my application forwards the sign-in request and somebody who is not assigned and fills in his details, then AD will say, yeah, you're not allowed to go further, so you don't have to manage that yourself. Okay, so adding an application to Azure AD, that wasn't that hard, and the documentation is pretty good up until this scenario, apart from the tenant ID and directory ID, which is a bit lacking. If we then go take a look at some other configuration which I added to my application, it's the connection string of my storage account, which is basically the root access to every file that's being stored. And then there's the connection string of my database. Here are my local values. These things contain a user ID and a password. So that's pretty sensitive information. We probably don't want those in our configuration files, even though if we control the environment where the application is stored, we probably want to avoid having that information being leaked everywhere. So we should have a safe way of storing this information, and that we can do with Key Vault, which was mentioned in another talk as well. So what did I do as well? If I find my screen of Azure, let's go back to my home page. Here I've added a Key Vault. If I go to secrets, you see I've added one secret in here, which is the connection string to my database. I can't get the value here out of it, which is already good. And I could use Key Vault to also store the storage account key, so I don't have to leak that information everywhere. And every piece of information that's critical can be stored here as well, and the application can use that as a configuration provider. How do we do that? Well, again, I added a package, Microsoft Azure Key Vault, and a configuration extension. And then in in program.cs, I build my configuration, and then I add Key Vault as a configuration provider. From then on, my application will look at my JSON file for its configuration, but also look at the Key Vault for further information. So the connection string can be removed from this application settings file, and it will be read from the Key Vault entry. But how does my application gain access to the Key Vault? Well, here you can see that in this sample I added a client ID and a client secret. It's commented out because that's not what I endorse you to do. The client ID is the ID of my application in Azure AD. A client secret offers me a way to have my application authenticate to Azure Active Directory as well. So not only can our users have an identity in Azure AD, also applications can have an identity, and I can assign roles and rights to those applications as well. So in this case, I need to create a client secret, which again is done in the Azure Portal. So we're back here, and we go back to Azure AD. And in this case, it's with app registrations. It's always a bit of a quest to find where is the information I need. So with single tenant app, I can again click settings. Here with keys, I can add I can here generate keys for this application. So passwords essentially for this application. You can create multiple if you want. It's only available once. If I create a new key and click save, then I need to store that value in somewhere in my configuration. So now my application can authenticate with Azure AD, which is fine, and this piece of code could be uncommented and it could be used as well. So all sensitive information is now out of my app settings.json and in my key vault, but then there's still this secret in my application.json. So there's still an issue. Anyone with that client ID and client secret could access that sensitive information. So a new feature in Azure is a managed identity of a service, which is, again, pretty straightforward to configure. So if I find it, so I go back home and I click on, this time not on Azure AD, but on the application service. And there I have an entry called Managed Service Identity, which for this application has been turned on. And what essentially this does is, again, it registers this application to the Azure AD, but it's hidden from me. I don't have to explicitly go and configure it. It's just it's managed by the Azure infrastructure for me. So now, if I could go back to the code, I can remove this piece of information, and now it's just one single line: add Azure Key Vault. And automatically the system will authenticate this application to the Azure AD and it will gain access. So now I can remove all sensitive configuration from the app settings, .j configuration file, and also not need this client secret anymore, which is a nice thing to have. So we went to the application. I told you about this. It can manage the secrets, like the connection strings, but you can also add certificates to Key Vault if you want, or it's really a source of configuration. And it also allows you to do things like key rotation more easily. Like if you want to change the connection string password every month or two, that's all. Yeah, it can all be managed from the Azure Key Vault without having the need of a separate process to manage this. The application will still just look up the same key with the same value, but it will just get automatically a new password if you've configured it like that. But you can fill an entire new session about Key Vault if you want. Managed identity. Here I just clicked assign me an identity for my application, which is pretty straightforward, but you can also define an identity yourself and have multiple application services have the same identity. Perhaps they all need to have the same access rights to other resources, so you only have to manage that once and use that same identity everywhere. Although that's supported, I wouldn't recommend it. I would say each application service probably has a specific function it will perform, so try to have a separate identity for every resource. It integrates with any resource that supports Active Directory authentication. Key Vault supports it, so it can automatically integrate. A storage account has the same capabilities, but it's currently in preview. If a storage account would go out of preview for this feature, then we also would no longer need a connection string for the storage account. Same for SQL database. Currently, that integration is in preview and not supported or not recommended to be used in production. When that goes out of preview, again, we would not need a connection string anymore for our application to access the database, but it could just use the application identity to access it. Basically, if you used anything with SQL Server and Windows, you have integrated security back on the Azure platform for your application. Then there's another tool which I use a lot, which is Azure DevOps. I won't go into much detail about it. It's called Azure DevOps. It's a horrible name, because it's not bound to Azure. You can perfectly build on-premise applications with it. It's just a place to store your code, have build pipelines configured, and have your repositories with your code. Who has used this before? Only one? Well, it's a great tool if I find my browser. So here I am signed in at the application with my sample code. There are 3 repositories in it. 3 Git repositories. I have a build pipeline, so the single tenant application build is defined over here. It's pretty straightforward. I can define tasks. There's a nice user interface to configure them. for the simple tasks, but if you need more difficult situations, which we'll cover in a bit, then you can just add script tasks here as well and have them executed. So in this case, I'm using a specific .NET Core SDK, restoring the code, building it, testing it, publishing the artifact. And then I have a release pipe cycle, so if the build succeeds, you can automatically have here a release triggered and it will be deployed to my Azure application service. Again, I have here just one step defined. Perhaps in a real application, I would also have a step to update the database with schema migrations, perhaps, and any other bits of info you need in a release. So that was a very fast look at how we could define an application in Azure with Visual Studio Team Service, Azure DevOps. This is what I have now, and for some applications that's enough. You can go to the Azure Portal, configure everything statically, go to your Visual Studio Azure DevOps website, configure there everything statically. The subscriptions are linked automatically, so I can just select, deploy this application, deploy this code to that application service. And that works fine. You can define also different environments. Perhaps there is a test environment which first needs to be deployed, then go to production. That's can all be covered. But building a multi-tenant application involves some level of dynamic code most of the time, or dynamic configuration. And one of the things you need to think about is how will I store the data of my application. Well, there are several things you can choose. I can deploy the resource group I showed you earlier with all of the moving pieces, again for the new tenant. So we're adding, let's say we're adding all of the football clubs here. I can deploy the entire environment for every football club 16 times in my case. And that can be a perfect use case. If you want extreme separation or isolation of your customers, then that's a valid use case, but it's also the most expensive one. There's no way to optimize the resource usage, because every tenant will have a SQL database and a SQL server and a web application, and you'll have to pay for everything 16 times. You can have a single application deployment, so it's just one app service, but you can have a multi-tenant database. I could have a column in my database with a tenant ID or customer ID, and query, whenever I issue a query to my database, just be explicit about the tenant ID, and I get only the data of my specific tenant. Or I could generate a schema for every tenant. That's a valid use case as well. We are just sticking it in the same database, so we don't have to manage multiple environments. Again, can be a valid use case. Or you could do this, which is my personal preference. You can have a single application deployment, so I only have to manage my code once and deploy it once to production, but I have a database per tenant, which gives me isolation, a good amount of isolation, because let's say tenant X screws up his data and calls me, could you restore it back to my to the previous day? Then that could be could be done easily. If it was all the data in the same database, it's hard to do a rollback, because we'll also roll back all of the data of the other users. What can we also do if it's a single app deployment with a multi-tenant database? We could store 3 tenants in a database and in another database other 3 tenants, so we can so we get better performances, perhaps for the case of if you want to specify, I have premium customers and they get better performance than the other ones. So what do we need? We need to provision a database per tenant. That's what I'm going to show you, and we need to update the schema changes if there are database changes. So what did I do for that? Let's go to another resource group. Here I have the multi-tenant SQL pool, and then there's the application. It doesn't have a default route, so I go to management. I'm going to say I'm going to add a new tenant. Tenant 2. I'm going to add a new user there. I've created a tenant here, and what's going to happen in the background? Well, several things. There, let's also open the code base. Well, first off, the management endpoint, if I can find it. That management endpoint is protected with a specific authorization policy. Only administrators can create tenants. I don't want my other users to create tenants. That's something I manage in Active Directory as well. So the tenant controller has another policy. It has a tenant user authorization policy. And if I go back to the Azure Portal, go to Azure Active Directory, I have created another dashboard for this. Single app multi-tenant data. Is it here? Yeah. Multi-tenant app. There's this other thing called manifest, which is, here you can see that there is a group for tenant 1 users and a group for tenant administrators, and in a few minutes, we'll see a new group appear, tenant 2 users. This manifest file can define application roles for my application. So I can, instead of doing the management of user groups in my Azure Active Directory, my application can define roles where I can assign users from my Active Directory to the application roles. And that application role can be used in my code. So there I can check if a specific user is in a specific group. So in this case, I'm just looking at the URL. If it says tenant 1, I'm just checking if he is in a specific group called tenant 1. If I provision tenant 2, which I did a few minutes ago, then I can check if he's in tenant number 2. So if I now go to resource group, by now we'll see a bit more. So there is this, here's the database, and then here you see 2 cryptic names. One of the 2 is for tenant 1, and the other one is for the second tenant I created. Because when I hit create tenant, what was happening in the background? Well, there is a Azure automation was added to this resource group, which is basically PowerShell running in Azure. And it has a job configured, provision new tenant. I can see here that it succeeded, so tenant 2 was successfully provisioned. And if we can also take a look at the code that was running. So I won't go into every detail. For that, you can visit me in the Ask Me booth later. So basically, my web application called this webhook of Azure Automation, and it executed an Azure Resource ARM template, or Azure Resource Management template, and that allows me to define a Azure environment statically and create it and update it at runtime. I'll show you that in a bit. So that's what happens in these files, and then I updated the application definition that has been registered in Active Directory, and I create a new group, which is done in this code, and then I assign the user to that group I created. So tenant 1 was created. It gets this code is executed. I execute the ARM template. I also send an invite if that's an unknown user. I create a group for that tenant, and then I assign that user to that group. Now it won't zoom. So by now, if I go back to my Active Directory and I go to the enterprise applications and I go to the multi-tenant application and I then go to users and groups, you'll see that my other Benny Michielsen account was already user
in tenant 1 user and has now also been assigned in the group for tenant 2 users. So I have 2 tenants configured at runtime. What's hard about this case, about this scenario, is the ARM template, because there is documentation, but yeah, we all know how that goes. How does an ARM template look like? It's a JSON file. It has 3 sections. It has parameters, which are data which you can feed the template. It has variables, which you can calculate values which are private to this template. And then there are resources which get deployed. So in this case, the tenant gets a database, so we deploy a database for it. It's assigned to a specific server, which is happening over here. And then I create a storage account. And that storage account is then is also created. And then I need to update my key vault with those new connection strings. That's done in the ARM template as well. Here I can add a new secret to the existing key vault and for the connection string, and then here for the storage account connection string. So you can define an entire ARM template here in code. You can use Visual Studio Code to create this. I've installed an extension which helps me a bit. There's a Visual Studio template which you can use to define them, but you can also export an existing resource group as an ARM template. So you can define everything statically, just hit create script or automation options, and you can get this for free and then change it where you need dynamic behavior. So you can create as many instances of this as you want. So we now got this information. I'm sorry if I did not add your popular football club to this slide. It was the top 4 when I made it. So we now have this information. There's a catalog with every tenant, like tenant 1 and the user that's invited. There's only one application service. So if I make changes to my code, I can just deploy it once. And then every club gets its own, every club has its data in isolation, so there's no mix-up. I have to care about, I need to include the where clause in my query. Don't have to think about that. Just get the right connection string, and that's managed by the application group, which is great. But that's not what the Pro League wanted. They wanted complete isolation for every tenant. So we also need to deploy application services dynamically. Which, yeah, sure, I can add an application service to the ARM template and be done with it. I can deploy them as for every club. But then I lose the ability to use Azure DevOps. Because if I go to Azure DevOps, I have this release pipe cycle. I'll already go to this one. Here, this is a release pipeline, so it's using my build output. And then it will contact then it will do these steps, which is updating a Azure website. But I now need dynamic behavior. Perhaps now I have 16 clubs in the Pro League. Tomorrow there's a new decision. We now have to support 32 clubs in the Pro League, perhaps. Then I would have to manage all of that information here. I have to copy all of the steps to provision a tenant, which involves manual work. I mean, there's manual work involved. There are problems or mistakes that will happen. So there's no out-of-the-box way to have multi-tenancy in Azure DevOps. So, but that didn't put us off, and we tried to automate Azure DevOps as well. There is an SDK for it, but it's not up to date, as in there's no .NET Standard report or .NET Core support. There is a REST API which you can use. Again, there is documentation for the endpoints, as in you can see I need to supply a GUID here, but which GUID is it? And there's a names here. So we did some reverse engineering to automate the provisioning of tenants in Azure DevOps. So for that I have another application. That's this one.
So here I didn't bother writing the entire application, so here I'm just going to provision tenant 1 and a user that has to be invited for said tenant. So what's happening, and it calls the provisioning services, which is some code we wrote, which will do HTTP calls to Azure DevOps. We will say we get a release definition, and we add a new tenant environment, and we create a release for it, and we will also deploy that release. So I've hit F5, so it has done or is doing stuff. So if I go now back to this page and refresh, you'll see that tenant 1 has been added. The entire release has been put in a task group, which is currently one step, so which is deploy ARM template, but you could again add multiple steps here, like update the database or call service X or Y. And if I then go to releases, we'll also see that a release is busy for tenant 1. So if we go to release 12, you'll see that he's currently deploying the ARM template and putting up an entire user, entire new resource group for this specific tenant. If I would need a second tenant, again, it would just be calling the provisioning service and will again get a new tenant environment provisioned for us. And this is something we use in real life as well. So we freed Azure DevOps the information which our administrator at the Pro League just enters. Oh yeah, there's a new football club, just enters a name, hit save, it's registered here and automatically released. Whenever we make changes to the code base, we don't have to think about all of the different environments. We just trigger a build, and then we can select all the tenants where we want to deploy new features to. So it's all managed here from the portal. The tricky bit about this setup is that an ARM template is bound to a specific resource group. And here I'm using two resource groups because there's a SQL pool behind it. So if I go to all resource groups, you'll see that now there's a resource group for my tenant 1 with an application service, a storage account, and the key vault. So it's completely isolated, but where's the database? Well, that's in another pool, this one, because you can't spread your databases across multiple resource groups. So here I have one database server with an elastic pool, and the tenant 1 database is here as well. That's something you need to be aware of. So we're using this so we don't have to pay exuberant amounts of performance cost for the SQL server. We can spread the cost, still spread the cost and gain the isolation levels. Time is up, but that's good because I showed you everything I wanted to see. So we now have this setup for every club. The entire system consists of this slide. We have an administration application, and for every club we have discrete environments, and they all managed by the same Active Directory. There's also some Power BI involved, etc., etc. So thank you for listening. I know it was a lot of information, but I'll be sharing the code snippets, etc., in the coming days. Thank you. It is part of the deployment, but not in the sample I showed you, but we do that. And it's relatively easy because here I have this task group contains the definition of a deployment. Here I'm just deploying the ARM template, which will provision me with whatever I want. we use .NET Core, and we use entity framework migrations to update the database, and we actually just add a step to this to execute the migration on the database, because you can also read Key Vault data from this release pipeline. So I just get a connection string from Key Vault and give that to this step, and it will update the database of that tenant. The name of the tenant I also store in the tenant environment. So if we go back to releases, when we provision a tenant, we add some data, of course. So if we go to edit and then to variables, you see this information is shared across all of the tenants, but here I have, for a specific stage, a specific tenant, the name of the tenant and the resource group it belongs to. I could also add what's the key of the connection string in Key Vault. If I just would provision that as well, then the pipeline could go and get a connection string from Key Vault and then do its job of updating the database.
Also, I have another question.
Sure.
You showed us a picture where you have multiple different applications and databases. Actually, this looks like a lot of single point applications. You have one single point like a new tool where you can research function, but it's actually single point.
I'm not completely following the question. It's not.
I mean, you have separate parts, and we have separate data, you have separate tenants, which is like the similar application that you have for your living application, because it's the same.
Yeah, it's this globe you mean, I think. It's the same code base, yeah, but they said we don't want to have the same data of the same tenant in the same process. So the only way to do that is to create a new instance of the application with the same code, but it has a different configuration. Yes, that's what I wanted, so that's what we gave them. As in, it's the same code base, but it's are different tenants. If we can't, or we currently not allow different logic for it for a tenant. If that's what you're after, but I'm not sure. Yeah, we wanted to use Redis, but then we looked at the cost. Since they didn't want us to have this data of the same tenant in the same data store, we would also have to deploy a Redis application. Redis has to be provisioned per tenant as well, so per resource group, which costs a lot of money in Azure. So that's why we didn't do it. Yes. Yeah, indeed.
So I'm just wondering what is the best practice for data evaluation, because we have a problem with our company, which is pursuing competency, but we say that you need to do proper data evaluation.
I find, in my own opinion, I prefer this approach, where there's still only one application service which I have to maintain and update, and separate it in a different database and for each tenant. And if you add Redis, then I would prefix the data of a specific tenant with a specific value. It's just like the application groups which I added to Azure Active Directory. Where if you know the keys which you can use to access the data, you can make that dynamic. But that's all advice I can give you, actually. These steps, they are mentioned on the Azure documentation as well, with some samples as to how to do this.
How do we manage upgrades, say,
Well, we also still have a QA and test environment where we deploy first. And that gives us, up until now, that has given us enough of a safety blanket to fall back on. If a migration fails because data is not how we thought it was, then we always have seen that on the test environment. And only if our tests on that environment are okay, then we'll deploy to each tenant individually. Then you need something in front of your access point where you can check from, oh, this is a new one, this one we migrated, and you'll forward it to another application. Now, I would use a proxy to differentiate the traffic between the two.
So, in case, for example, you have
I'm going to see
some tenants